So welcome again to everyone for being here. I also want to thank Knox College for hosting us. I know that seems strange because you're in your home and I'm in mine and everything, but the platform is actually being provided through a Knox license. So we are grateful to them for that. Let me give you just an idea of what we're going to do. I am deeply grateful to Robert Revington and Junwon Kim, who are acting as co-hosts in this meeting. So throughout this meeting, we will be trying to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And we have it organized ahead of time, who's doing what, and we will do our best to make sure that things do run smoothly. I am going to invite Robert to share the screen for us so that we have the PowerPoint up and going while I introduce our speaker, which is Angus Sutherland, who's known to many of us, of course. Angus is a retired minister of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. He identified the fact that he had actually failed history in school, but started collecting coins and suddenly found history very, very fascinating. He has chaired the Committee on History and the committee overseeing the National Presbyterian Museum, now the Presbyterian Heritage Center. He's considered the top Canadian expert on communion tokens and has led seminars at national and regional numismatic events. Sorry for my mispronunciation of that word. He lives with his wife, Sarah, in Cambridge, Ontario, and their house backs onto the Grand River, which is very appropriate for this paper. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Angus, and invite you to present.
Thank you, Stuart. Okay. In a review of Carl Benn's book, A Mohawk Memoir of the War of 1812, J.C.A. Skaggs of the University of Virginia writes, the name of Mohawk leader John Norton is not unknown to Canadians. I believe that Professor Skaggs is in error, that the vast majority of Canadians have no knowledge of John Norton or his accomplishments. In my early reading of several books on First Nations history, I have never seen the name John Norton. And the 1998 first edition of the Canadian Encyclopedia makes no mention of him whatsoever. Fortunately, this oversight has been corrected in later editions. Stories of the part played by First Nations in the War of 1812 have mentioned Tecumseh and his brother, but have too often missed altogether the very important role played by John Norton. In my own schooling and reading, I had heard much of the names such as John Graves Simcoe, Sir Isaac Brock, Sir Gordon Drummond, Laura Secord, Joseph Brant, Sir Walter Scott, and William Wilberforce. When I purchased the book, The Journal of Major John Norton, 1816, which was published by the Champlain Society's second edition in 2011, it was because I thought an insider's view of the War of 1812 would be fascinating. While this proved true, I found myself at the same time introduced to a man who was both a Scot and a Cherokee by birth, who purportedly spoke 4 European and 12 First Nations languages, who wrote extensively on matters touching Canadian and First Nations history, who was a soldier and a leader of the First Nations during the War of 1812, who was the first translator for the British and Foreign Bible Society, and who in the course of his life met all and befriended most of the persons I have named. For many years, the Journal of John Norton lay all but forgotten in the library of the Duke of Northumberland at his estate in Alnwick Castle. Norton dedicated his journal to the man who was Duke of Northumberland at the time of writing, and the manuscript has been passed down through the family since then. At the end of the Second World War, microfilms of the journal were made and placed in the British Museum and the Library of Congress. The work was effectively rediscovered by the Champlain Society in 1966. As a result, it is only in recent years that this hero of the War of 1812 is beginning to be remembered and to be given the honor that is due to him. The purpose of this paper is to present in this, the 250th anniversary of his birth, an outline of the life of John Norton with an emphasis on his Christian faith. I am indebted to Dr. Carl Benn of Ryerson University and Dr. Timothy Willig of Indiana University, South Bend, for their recent studies and writings on the history of the period. It is notable that his biographers cannot write of his life without making strong and clear comments on his Christian faith. The man and his faith cannot be separated. As I begin, I note that this paper, in this paper, the word Indian will only appear in direct quotes from the period or in official names, for example, the Indian Department. Otherwise, the terms First Nations or the specific names of the indigenous nations will be used. It should also be noted that the terms Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, and Six Nations are interchangeable. And I would like to note that on occasion, there may be references to the Five Nations, which was the term commonly used at the time, even though the Sixth Nation, the Tuscarora, had already joined the Confederacy. John Norton's story begins in the Carolinas in the early 1700s. After a battle, a Cherokee child of approximately 11 years of age was rescued from a burning building by a Scottish soldier whose name presumably was Norton. The child was taken back to Scotland. It was believed that he had burns from the fire. He was nursed back to health and raised there, given the name John Norton. As a young man, he met and married or entered into a relationship with a woman named Christian Anderson. And on the 16th of December, 1770, they had a child who was baptized the following day at the parish church at Crail, Fife, and given the name John Norton. The next slide can be put up, please. The young John Norton's early education was undertaken by the parish, and it seems that he took the teachings to heart. At the age of 16, he followed his father into military service, signing on with his father's regiment, the 65th Foot, as a drummer. Detachments of the regiment were sent to Quebec in 1785 and 1786, and both John's, father and son, arrived in Canada among them. Christian Anderson also came to Canada, serving as a domestic to one John Coffin, one of several of that surname who were in government in Montreal and Quebec. It was not unusual in those days for men to join the military in order to get passage to the New World and then to desert and find a place to settle and work. It must have been like a homecoming for John Sr., who found himself both in the Montreal area and a little later in Western New York at Fort Niagara, coming into contact with the Haudenosaunee, whose speech was of the same linguistic family as Cherokee. Having been taught the Cherokee language, at least in part, by his father, John Jr. was as aware of his native heritage as he was of his Scottish birth. Twice, John Jr. ran away from Fort Niagara. In March of 1787, and having been returned to his regiment again in June of that year. While desertion normally carried severe penalties, John Jr. was granted a discharge in February of 1788 at the instigation of the Coffin family, perhaps being bought out of the army as was allowed at the time. The assumption is that his mother and used what influence she had in order to arrange his safe release. Carl Benn, quote, notes this, quote, his desertion, which normally would be regarded as disreputable, did not seem to affect the readiness of army officers to work with or respect him during the War of 1812, suggesting that there were mitigating circumstances surrounding the events of the 1780s, end quote. Please note that from this point on, the name of John Norton will be used solely to refer to the Scottish-born son and the subject of the paper. After his discharge, John spent a little time among the Cayuga in North New York State, and then took a position as a school teacher in Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory near Belleville, Ontario. Unhappy with the lot of a teacher, he found his way to the Ohio Territory, where he worked as a trader while actively supporting the cause of the natives there who were facing American expansion. He worked as an employee of a trader named John Askin. A period article from the Missouri Gazette, quoted by Carl Benn, spoke of Norton this way, quote, he frequently had a few goods on credit, but always, like an Indian, he never traded for profit. All he wished for was to trade enough furs to pay his merchant, and then the remainder of his goods were given to his Indian friends and relations, end quote. Around this time, Norton was noticed by Chief Joseph Brant, or Taindanagea, of the Haudenosaunee. The next screen can come up. Brant and many of his people lived along the Grand River, having been offered their land there as a thanks for their support of the British during the American War of Independence. Brant, seeing great value in Norton, his experience as a soldier, his love and support of First Nations people, his Christian faith, which Brant shared, and his considerable linguistic skills, eventually adopted John as a nephew and as his successor as leader of the Six Nations of the Grand River. Norton was given the name Deoninhokarawan, which means he keeps the door open, and is said to honor frankness and an open heart. Norton was recommended by Brant as a translator for the Indian Department, and Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe approved the recommendation. Norton took up the position in 1796, and Brant was pleased to have an ally and observer within the department. In 1800, Norton resigned from the Indian Department. His resignation may coincide with the appointment of William Claus as Deputy Superintendent General of the Indian Department. Claus, though respected for other accomplishments, was in open opposition to Joseph Brant and John Norton throughout his tenure in that position, which he held until his death in 1826. It seems that this opposition may have had its roots in the fact that Brant, if unsatisfied with the decisions of the Indian Department, had no problem going over their heads to his influential friends in Britain. Claus, for his part, did not hesitate to use lies and misrepresentations or to manipulate others in order to undermine the purposes of Brant and Norton. It may be fairly stated that John Norton's single greatest enemy was William Claus. A case in point is when in 1804, Joseph Brant delegated John Norton to go to Britain for the express purpose of getting the British to approve the contentious Haldimand Grant, which gave to the Six Nations the land for 5 miles on each side of the Grand River from mouth to source. After a short stay in New York, John Norton traveled to Britain, where he quickly befriended a man whose name was William Allen, a Quaker. Through Allen, Norton was introduced to a group of Christians, the influential group that history has come to know as the Clapham sect. Deoninhokarawan, Norton, made a strong impression on these folk of Clapham. In his journal entry for July 30th, 1804, William Wilberforce noted that, quote, "We are all extremely struck with Mr. Norton, his blended modesty and self-possession, his good sense and simple propriety of demeanor," end quote. For his part, John Norton was confirmed and reinvigorated in his Christian faith by Wilberforce and other members of the Clapham sect, with whom he continued to correspond. In Norton's own words, quote, "I have been, as it were, led by the hand to the abode of those who love and revere the system and precepts God has ordained for us, and daily study by what means they may fulfill his will. I have been much rejoiced by the additional strength that I have thereby received in religion," end quote. Through powerful contacts, Norton was making headway, but William Claus learned of the venture and arranged a meeting of hand-picked opponents of Joseph Brant, getting them to disavow Norton and his purpose. Brant and other supporters were not invited. A letter of disavowal signed by so-called chiefs was sent to Britain, effectively ending Norton's bid to have the Privy Council approve the Haldimand Grant. Despite this disheartening failure, there was still something to be gained. The so-called Clapham sect was at the time organizing what was to become the British and Foreign Bible Society. They harnessed John Norton's presence and skills by having him translate the Gospel of John into Mohawk. Next screen, please. And this became the first publication of the society. Norton returned without the Haldimand Grant having been given official sanction, but with 500 copies of his translation of the Gospel of John to be distributed to the Six Nations people. Norton's introduction to the translation is commemorated in a stained glass window in Her Majesty's Royal Chapel of the Mohawk. Next screen. The quote is edited. Norton's full statement is, "Let us strictly adhere to what our Lord has translated to us in the Holy Scriptures, that thereby the unbelievers in viewing us may become enamored with the gospel and may know that we are truly pious by the love we bear the commandments of God. Joseph Brant died in 1807, and Norton took leadership on many of Brant's projects. Both Brant and Norton believed that the future of the First Nations lay in agriculture, and they sought to help and teaching of the British in helping their people to learn what was necessary. They also dreamed of a future homeland for First Nations of Canada and the United States. They envisioned a future where Native peoples could live together and work together in a country all their own. Timothy Willig writes, quote, Norton's zeal for acculturationist reforms stems in large part from his genuine Christian faith. Norton had internalized and personalized his faith to a much greater degree than most Mohawks. Wherever he went, he sought opportunities to worship with other Christians. He was determined to eventually bring all Native peoples to the knowledge of the beliefs he had adopted, end quote. Carl Benn comments further on Norton's faith. Quote, despite his Protestantism, Norton had apparently married once or twice through Native custom rather than through the rites of the church. And he participated in spiritually charged Indigenous rituals, such as the war dance. He also spoke with esteem of the great nativist spiritual reform associated with the Seneca prophet named Handsome Lake, Ganeodio. Norton showed his respect when they met in 1809, telling the Seneca, I am thankful that it is, this is a quote, I am thankful that it has pleased the Almighty to make you the means of bringing many to walk in the paths he has marked out for us. As well, he used both native and newcomer religious language in more or less the same breath and equated the Great Spirit with the Christian God. Indeed, in the notes, his notes on the Gospel of John, Norton equates Jehovah with Raweniyo, the Mohawk word for God, and that's end quote. 1809, 1810, John Norton undertook a journey by canoe from the Grand River to the land of the Cherokees in the neighborhood of present-day Tennessee. His journal tells of this adventure and is well worth reading. While he was there, he took the opportunity to share his faith. And a quote, as the Cherokee village of Willstown in present-day northern Alabama, he addressed the chiefs in council there, laying before them that which is due from man to God, the frailty of the one, the great mercy of the other. A brief account of the creation, the fall, and the redemption of the world by our Lord Jesus, with the duties he inculcates and their application to life, end quote. At the threat of war between the Canadas and the United States, Norton returned to the Grand River area. When war broke out, he was asked by Sir Isaac Brock to take leadership of the native warriors supporting Great Britain, and given the rank of captain. Ben tells us, quote, as the threat of his hostilities grew, Teoninhokaruen hoped that the military's expanding influence would allow the Iroquois to confirm clear title over the land granted to them by Frederick Haldimand in 1784. Yet as the international situation deteriorated, he set these issues aside for the moment at Brock's request, end quote. Because Norton had been working for recognition for the Haldimand grant for so long, this must have been a difficult decision. But it is clear that he believed that the British were far more likely to enable the creation of a First Nations homeland than was the United States government. During the war, Teoninhokaruen led loyal warriors of several First Nations at the Detroit front and other parts of Michigan, but predominantly at the Niagara front. His leadership is most noticeable at Queenston Heights. With Sir Isaac Brock killed in a force of some 6,000 Americans holding the heights, Teoninhokaruen and his soldiers, his warriors, numbering about 80, set about harrying the American troops until reinforcements could arrive. Norton had addressed the warriors. He said, quote, comrades and brothers, be men. Remember the fame of ancient warriors whose breasts were never daunted by odds of number. Let not their numbers appall you. Look up, it is he above who shall decide our fate, end quote. With war whoops and attack and withdraw tactics, they unnerved the Americans to the point that when reinforcements eventually arrived, the British found an enemy that was thoroughly demoralized. The American presence had shrunk due to a degree to casualties, but for the most part to desertion back to the river, escaping the wild Indians, perhaps leaving only 500 effective men on the heights by that time. In essence, Deonin Hukarawen, John Norton, and his warriors won the Battle of Queenston Heights. The First Nations contributed to the victory and, the contribution to the victory was finally recognized in 2016, notably on the 200th anniversary of Norton's journal, prompting this comment from Canadian author and amateur historian Don Cummer, who wrote in 2016, and you can change the screen, please. His quote, "I wish I could have been there last Sunday at the highest point of the park at the top of Queenston Heights, where a decisive battle was fought 204 years ago. A monument was unveiled honoring the warriors from First Nations who played such a pivotal role in the War of 1812. Next screen. Among the figures portrayed at the monument is John Norton. The other is John Brant, son of Joseph Brant. One of the most intriguing people in Canadians' history was John Norton. If not for his tactical brilliance at Queenston Heights and his political acumen at Burlington Heights, I doubt whether Canada would be a country today," end quote. Following the war, Norton was given the brevet rank of Major in recognition of his leadership, bravery, and service to the Crown. He was also given land along the Grand River, close to where the town of Caledonia now stands. However, Norton did not rest on his laurels. He continued to work for the betterment of the Grand River Haudenosaunee. Next screen, please. He had taken his wife, his third, and it seems that this one was more than 20 years his junior. In 1813, he had in 1813 he was married, and he had a son from a previous marriage who was born in 1799, and who also bore the name John Norton. It is notable that this marriage was according to the rites of the Church of England. Following the war, John Norton returned to Britain, taking his young wife and his son with him and enrolling them in schools in Scotland, in Dunfermline, and he worked for completing his journal. And while there, he took the opportunity to contact the friends he had made on his earlier journey, lobbying for the good of the First Nations in the British Canadian colonies. He was received by the Prince Regent, later George IV, and was given a gift of high-quality rifles for use of the Grand River peoples. His activities on behalf of the Grand River Haudenosaunee appear to have paid off. A letter dated January 2nd, 1816 was written by Henry Goulburn, Under Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, and it said this, quote, "I am directed to assure you that there is no difficulty on the part of His Majesty's government to admit that the grant of the Grand River, which was after the peace of 1783 made to the Five Nations and their posterity, is a grant as full and binding upon the government as any other made in Canada and to individual settlers." He also wrote that the Six Nations had authority to apportion land within the tract as they saw fit, while the Crown possessed no such right unless the chiefs asked the Crown to intervene, end quote. While Norton expected some resistance from a stubborn Upper Canadian government, he nonetheless believed that this declaration would be carried through, and enthusiastically reported his success to a council of the Six Nations. However, the Indian Department, by a vigorous resilience to anyone opposing their agenda, ignoring their superiors across the ocean, took advantage of their control over the distribution of information, used their enviable political skills, and in the end got their way. Corruption in the department was not universal, but the story as it relates to the Six Nations in Norton's day was a grim one indeed. Norton came to resent the department as the primary obstacle of preventing the process of acculturation and political autonomy for the Indians dwelling in Upper Canada. The Mohawk leader further suggested that the government turn the vast expense of the Indian Department towards the end of bettering the situation of the Indians. We can perhaps sympathize with his desire to defund the largely corrupt Indian Department. Norton did not give up writing letters and seeking help from Britain. Meanwhile, he worked his farm and he continued serving the church, baptizing people along the Grand River in absence of ordained clergy. Along with his work towards the land claims of his people, the Onintokarwan longed for the Six Nations to learn of Christ, but repeated requests for clergy to be sent from Britain to serve the Six Nations had gone unheeded. Timothy Willig writes, quote, Norton rejected the idea that natives could not become Christian while they were still thriving cultures and independent peoples. He believed that genuine Christian missions should attempt to bolster the natives' quality of life and independence and prevent the Indians' slide into the status of wards. Norton believed that the negative white influence in undermining native cultures had particularly prejudiced indigenous peoples against the light of the gospel, end quote. In 1823, Norton had a violent confrontation with an Onondaga chief named Joseph Crawford, or Kahishoro Wanenen. It was reported as a duel at the time, but centered on Norton's wife. But it lacked the gentlemanly attributes attributed to duels. As the men struggled for a gun, it went off, the bullet passing through Crawford's thigh. He died 2 days later. Norton was very much aggrieved at the death and offered himself up to the authorities for trial at Niagara. He was found guilty of manslaughter and fined 25 pounds. Carl Benn writes, quote, one newspaper claimed Onintokarwan endured more than was necessary, noting that his conduct in the affair was truly honorable, and he no doubt would have been acquitted altogether if he had not, from feelings of delicacy, withheld his best defense. He left his wife, though provided for her care before leaving, and left Upper Canada, traveling south to the land of the Cherokee. In 1824, it is known that he was at the Dwight Mission in Arkansas Territory, which was a Presbyterian mission, and he had arranged for his mail to be sent there. He traveled on to Texas, continuing to connect with Christian missions. A record of a Moravian mission is the sole reference to his death, indicating that John Norton died in 1827 in his 57th year. Where exactly he died and where he is buried is unknown. Can we have the next, please? And again, the next. Onintokarwan was long forgotten, but various biographers and historians are currently unearthing his story and restoring his name to the history of the Six Nations, to Upper Canada, and to the War of 1812. And next screen, please. Roger Hall, general editor for the Champlain Society 2011 edition of Norton's journal, refers to Onintokarwan as, quote, a complex man who stood astride two cultures with sensitivity, kindness, and intelligence, end quote. Above all, Onintokarwan showed himself to be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ. Having a foundation in faith established by Presbyterians, encouraged and strengthened by Quakers and Anglicans, he shared and participated readily with all Christian missions he came across in his travels. He exhibited a genuine love for all people, though especially for the First Nations people in Canada and in the United States. He called his people to faith, and he called governments of the insurgent settlers to justice. May his voice continue to speak today. Conclusion. This paper barely scratches the surface of Norton's story, but hopefully will encourage those who hear it and read it to discover more of this hero of our past, especially noting that in all his endeavors, in war and in adversity and in peace, in facing antagonism, injustice, prejudice, and hardship, his faith in Jesus Christ shines through. And you can put on the next screen. And thank you, that's it.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Angus, for this paper. This is one of the strange things about being online, is normally there would be applause. What I'm going to suggest we're going to do is move to our next paper, and then we'll have the question and answers. And then we're all going to unmute at the very end and applaud both of our speakers. But thank you, Angus. I'm going to call on you, Robert, to present your paper now. And I know you're going to share screen. You've done a great job on the other, doing that for Angus. But if you want to do that, and then I will just say a few words of introduction to you. So let's see.
Are you going now?
We don't have anything just yet, Robert. Okay. June 1, oh, there it is. That's great. And we'll get it up. And while you're doing that, Robert Revington is a third-year PhD student at Knox College in church history with 2 previous MAs from McMaster University. His doctoral research examines how the modern academic study of the Bible has been received in churches. He also plays hockey, and in 2019 fulfilled a long-held dream by going skydiving dressed in a Superman costume from head to toe. And I would now invite you, Robert, to present this paper on George L. Robinson.
Thanks, Stuart, and welcome to everyone who has come to watch the CSPH on Zoom this morning. As many of you will know, in 1915, the current Knox College building officially opened near the University of Toronto campus. And perhaps not surprisingly, when this happened, Knox had a formal dedication for the new building. This event should have been a wonderful celebration, a true milestone in the college's history, and it also should have attracted a great deal of positive publicity for the college across Canada. Alas, that was not the case. The festivities were diminished by a much less positive story. A former Knox College professor, Dr. George L. Robinson, had returned to the college for the festivities, but got in a heated exchange with some members of the Toronto media, who put him on the spot in the unenviable position of having to justify why his home country, the United States, was not participating in the First World War, or Great War, when Canada was. Robinson was a pacifist, so when he defended American neutrality, his response provoked great anger within Canada, and the resulting media attention overshadowed the formal dedication of the new college building, and actually forced Knox to eventually release a statement disavowing his views. This essay will cover Robinson's life and interactions with Knox College, and we'll hear more about that fateful night, but first we need to know a bit more about who George Robinson was. He was a renowned Bible scholar who lived from 1864 to 1958. He grew up in West Hebron, New York, and first studied at Princeton. After getting a first degree at Princeton, he taught at a Protestant school in Lebanon for a few years, then returned to Princeton, completed a doctorate in Berlin, and got married in Egypt along the way. One of his daughters tragically died young, as did his first wife, but he eventually remarried. He had a successful career teaching in Chicago for many years and contributed to biblical archaeology. Of particular note, he discovered a high place or sacrificial site in Petra. He also visited the cave of Machpelah in Palestine at a time when few others from the West were able to, and it is the traditional burial site of such Old Testament figures as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But before most of his more famous achievements, at the beginning of his academic career, he taught at Knox from 1896 to 1898. But I discovered something a few years ago, that Robinson had written an autobiography, but it doesn't seem to have been used as a source in too many major works on the Presbyterian Church in Canada. For example, John Moyer's Enduring Witness and Brian Fraser's History of Knox College do not show any awareness of Robinson's autobiography. It's not even in the Knox College Library or the University of Toronto library system, although there is a copy at Presbyterian College in Montreal. Even so, it seemed to me that this source had been overlooked in reconstructions of the history of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. I actually found it almost by accident while I was still at McMaster. So, in his autobiography, Robinson recalls that in 1896 he returned to the United States after completing his theological education in Germany. He writes, "Returning to America after having spent 2 years in Germany, many good Presbyterians assumed that I had probably lost my fundamentals and had gone over to the higher criticism. Having said that, he was soon hired as the minister of a Presbyterian church in Boston, Roxbury Presbyterian. But he had barely started at Roxbury when he began to receive job offers of a different nature, to be a professor from Knox College and at McCormick Seminary in Chicago. They were both in need of professors of Hebrew. He had previously spent a week in Toronto for a conference without knowing of Knox College's desire to hire him. In deciding between the two places, at that time he had a personal dislike of the city of Chicago and told a McCormick professor named A.S. Carrier, "I'll go wherever the Lord calls me, but I will never go to Chicago." The reply was admittedly flippant, but although Robinson may have become a world-class scholar on the book of Isaiah, he does not appear to have shared Isaiah's gift for prophecy, because after teaching at Knox, he would eventually live more than half a century in Chicago. Nonetheless, in 1896, he ended his time at Roxbury Presbyterian Church and accepted the position at Knox College and admitted, "Few men have so short a pastorate as I had at Roxbury. It had only been a matter of months, and the church had to find a new minister." He recalls that Knox College in 1896 was the principal theological seminary in Canada. Sir William Mortimer Clark, who later became the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, was the chairman of the Board of Managers, and the Very Reverend Dr. William Caven was the highly honored principal. Both of these men were recognized generally as representatives of the Christian faith. He describes Principal Caven as a friend and one of the most capable administrators and spiritual counselors of the Presbyterian Church in the Dominion. Brian J. Fraser notes that Robinson was replacing Robert Ewell Thompson at Knox after the latter's tragic early death. Thompson's death coincided with the retirement of William Gregg. So when Robinson and Hope W. Hogg of Oxford were nominated by the college board before General Assembly, Fraser records that a storm of criticism appeared in letters and editorials in the weekly church press. The Presbyterian Record noted that there was resistance to these appointments because Knox was hiring strangers from abroad rather than well-qualified Canadian graduates of Knox College itself. So, in the end, Robinson, the American, was approved, but Hogg was not. He was replaced with James Ballantyne, a former Knox graduate from Stratford, Ontario. Regardless, in his autobiography, Robinson tells us exactly where he lived in 1896, 619 Spadina. Now that address doesn't exist today, but it seems to have been roughly in the position of the current University of Toronto Athletic Centre and not far from where Graduate House is. It also is on the opposite side of the street from where Knox Presbyterian Church on Spadina now stands. It's at 630, and Robinson, his address then was at 619. He lived with a lady who would live to be 100 years old, but at that time had 2 small children. Robinson also recalls the college was located two blocks from us in a large and imposing building in the very middle of broad Spadina Avenue. Now, the site of the old Knox College building is now the Daniels Building on 1 Spadina Crescent, and the college actually returned to this site for its convocation in 2019. Robinson recalls that each professor had his own lecture room with an anteroom for his own personal convenience. Relationships between students and faculty were quite different in 1896 than they are today. Robinson recalls, professors were not expected to speak to their students when they met, either in the halls of the college or on the street. And I'm grateful to say that students of Stewart do not have this arrangement today. But Robinson compared this to how Francis L. Patton, a former Knox graduate and the eventual president of Princeton, when he was at Princeton, found it irksome to be expected to say good morning to a student. Robinson also shares memories of home dinners he was invited to while at Knox, including one occasion hosted by Sir William Mortimer Clark and his wife. He learned an interesting point of British etiquette. At one of these dinners, he offered to help Mrs. Clark into the dining room, and she taught him that in Britain, a married man never offers his left arm to anyone but his wife. Apparently, this stipulation did not affect his right arm, which she took. Robinson writes that Knox's academic year was 6 months, which he appreciated because it gave a great opportunity for travel in the summer. After that first summer, Robinson reflects that my second year at Knox College was pretty satisfactory, as was the first. He made a notable contribution to the college at this time. Robinson lamented the fact that Knox College lacked scholarships equivalent to those he had received as a student at Princeton, and shares that I set about and found 2 or 3 of the church, well-to-do friends who responded, and $600 was given for a graduate fellowship in the Old Testament Hebrew department, and the same amount for the New Testament Greek. The winner of the Old Testament honor was Gilbert Wilson, one of the strongest preachers for years in Chicago, and the winner of the New Testament honor was E.A. Witcher, who for well nigh 30 years taught the New Testament in California. Although the numbers do not match, this is probably the same scholarship that Fraser was discussing when he mentions that at the urging of Robinson, the college established its first 2 traveling scholarships in 1898 of $300 each, where Robinson had said $600 in his autobiography. I'm inclined to think Fraser is right because he had sources closer to the time. But Robinson did not stay at Knox for much longer. Although he had turned down McCormick Seminary in Chicago before, Cyrus H. McCormick continued to court Robinson for his seminary, telling him, if not at the end of your first year at Knox, then at mid-year following. If not then at the end of your second year in Toronto. Robinson says that he asked different people for advice and claims that God told him, better forget your antipathy for Chicago. In addition to divine prompting, it probably didn't hurt that McCormick offered him a full professorship and a much larger stipend, good enough for a large house of his own. Yet as it happened, when he told Sir Clark he was leaving Knox for McCormick, Clark replied, but why didn't you come to me before deciding? We had a promotion to offer you. Robinson told him, it was not I who really decided the matter. Robinson reiterates that he didn't really want to go to Chicago, but felt that God seemed to point an open door and he must obey. He let go of his dislike of Chicago because he heard the master calling. I too hope that someday, like Robinson, I will have 2 seminaries fighting for the opportunity to offer me a full professorship by my mid-30s, but I suspect that won't happen. Knox found an able replacement for Robinson, John E. McFadden. Though his replacement was quite competent, Robinson admitted, in his words, it was with sincere love and deep regret that I left my work at Knox. Robinson's wife, Jessie, also seems to have made an impression at Knox at that time for her influence in the foreign missionary work of the church. But 17 years later, Robinson was one of many invited guests for the formal dedication of the new Knox College building. Sir William Mortimer Clark had directly invited him, and he specifically notes that Sir William, his wife, and their daughters were all quite friendly at the time of the Knox College new building dedication in 1915. Robinson recalls that 10 prominent educators from Great Britain were present. In his account of that night, he adds, I delivered my address with great care, conscious of the quality of the audience, and I sat down with unaccustomed appreciation and applause. I feel obligated to say this much because of what was precipitated by the daily newspaper reporters. The rest of the evening was not so pleasant and tragically overshadowed this great occasion. Robinson made headlines because some newspaper reporters he described as eager patriots asked Robinson, an American, to justify his country's neutrality. He describes the exchange as follows. I replied, I am a neutral and come from the States. President Woodrow Wilson urges us to declare our neutrality with emphasis always and everywhere. They quickly responded, then you are pro-German. I answered, it takes two to fight. Robinson laments, this was enough. Toronto papers were aflame. From Halifax to Vancouver, the morning papers printed the incident promptly, and the mayor of Chicago telegraphed, intern him. Furthermore, during dinner with Sir William and Lady Clark, he received a phone call from the minister of Knox Presbyterian Church on Spadina. Robinson was scheduled to give a public lecture at the church, but the minister told him, we're expecting to hear you lecture as scheduled in Knox, but if you do, I fear we may provoke trouble. Robinson agreed, and the church canceled the event. Fraser's account of this controversy adds that Robinson's lecture was supposed to be on Palestine and the war for the alumni conference. Given that Robinson's lecture also pertained to the war, it's not hard to see why it was canceled in light of the controversy. Regardless, Fraser writes that Robinson's views were not unusual for progressive churchmen of his age, especially from the US, and compares this to how James A. MacDonald of the Globe and Mail voiced similar sentiments at a peace rally about a month later and had to step down as managing editor of the Toronto Globe. Robinson didn't know what else would come of the incident, but he did receive an honorary doctorate from Knox. He thanked Sir William and his family for being excellent hosts and returned to Chicago. He quotes a letter he received from the Reverend J. Johnston of Montreal, who wrote that he sent hearty congratulations for Robinson's honor, and reflected of Robinson's time as a professor at Knox, that the time, however, was long enough for you to find your way into the hearts of many in Canada, and there I need not assure you, you have and will have an abiding place. Alluding to the media controversy, Reverend Johnston wrote, the little tempest which Toronto, a city never characterized by too broad a spirit, raised over your interview will not, I trust, be sufficient to mar the pleasure of your visit. I cannot but regret the exhibition of narrowness which the incident offered. That is something of an understatement. A report in the Vancouver Daily World at the time noted that Robinson had said that Britain was as much to blame for the war as Germany, because Britain had developed her navy, while Germany had developed her army. According to the article, Robinson claimed that Britain's attempt to starve Germany by cutting off supplies was savage and inhuman. The article adds, the reverend gentleman then went on to point out that although Germany was stooping to barbaric methods, the conflict in her case was a matter of life and death. The article praised Loyal Toronto for canceling Robinson's lecture, but the unnamed author argued that Knox should immediately rescind Robinson's honorary degree. And the article sarcastically ended as follows. Anyone who declares the British Navy brought about the war and who excuses German atrocities needs an elementary course in history and in the principles of evidence rather than a degree in divinity. Back in Chicago, a headline in the Chicago Tribune read, Canada honors Chicago theologue, then is lashed. The article said, Toronto was startled by Robinson's words. It added, many could scarcely comprehend it when they heard Dr. Robinson describe England's effort to starve Germany as savagery. It also attacked Robinson because he had said England could have done more to protect the Lusitania. Robinson had linked his pacifism with that of William Jennings Bryan, who later participated in the Scopes trial. The Chicago paper stated, surprised at his interview, is caused not so much by the fact that an American should hold such views, but that holding them he should accept an honor from a Canadian college. The article goes on to say that much criticism is arising against the college. It records an exchange between media and Knox principal Gandier as a reporter asked him, "Do you think he was a suitable man for the college to honor?" Gandier replied, "Of course we knew nothing of his position on this question, and perhaps it was none of our business." The reporter asked, "If you had known his position, would it have made any difference?" Gandier answered, "Of course I can't say as to that." Although Robinson's autobiography presents a harmonious picture of his time with Sir William Mortimer Clark, in the newspaper article, Robinson admitted that the two of them had had a heated argument. As Fraser writes, Knox College had to issue a formal statement criticizing his views. A wire service report was found in newspapers all over Canada. In the Calgary Herald, it was subtitled, "Knox College Senate is sore at Professor Robinson." The Knox College statement said that if Robinson's views had been known, the college would not have given him his honorary doctorate. That Robinson is entitled to hold his own views on the war is admitted, but it is considered that in view of the fact he was a guest of a portion of the British Empire, his interview accusing Britain of being equally responsible and waging inhumane warfare was in the worst possible taste. Ultimately, Knox College did not rescind the honor, but they did issue this statement. And a short blurb in the Gazette in Montreal criticized Knox College for giving Robinson the degree and stated, "These are times when colleges need to be careful as to whom they delight to honor. A man's political opinions may suffice to disrupt his reputation for theological acquirements." Not long after, an article titled "A Pacifist Dilemma in the Star Phoenix in Saskatchewan" also criticized Robinson for saying that the European powers had done more to put Turkey in her proper place a century ago. In any event, the media attention from the controversy put Knox College in a bad light and attracted far more attention than the fact the college had opened its excellent new building. Fraser, looking back at Robinson's time at Knox, groups Robinson among 4 other Knox faculty hired near the turn of the 20th century, including James Ballantyne, W. Holliday Douglas, John D. Robertson, and Robinson's successor, John E. McFadden. Fraser identifies Robinson and the other 4 as men open to a more progressive orthodoxy. Fraser is not necessarily wrong, but at the same time, Robinson's progressiveness should not be overstated. Both then and now, Robinson would be considered a conservative Bible commentator. In the 1950s, he noted that when he was at Princeton in the 1890s, Charles Augustus Briggs of Union Theological Seminary faced heresy charges, and Robinson lamented, "Today Princeton is teaching the chief claims which Briggs advocated, that Moses did not write all that is ascribed to him in the Pentateuch, nor Isaiah all of the book ascribed to him. My own views were the traditional ones and still are." Like his former Knox colleague, William Caven, Robinson contributed an essay to The Fundamentals, 1910 to 1915, a 12-volume collection outlining conservative Protestant beliefs that was printed in the United States. Robinson argued in this work that the prophet Isaiah wrote the entire canonical book of Isaiah, a view that is unquestionably conservative. Robinson concluded that if modern scholars denied that the historical Isaiah had the ability to predict events centuries after his own time, then the latter part of the book lost its religious value. In Mark Noll's discussion of the essays in the Fundamentals, Noll writes, "It is hard to avoid labeling the position a defensive one." But Noll adds, "To be sure, the authors often argue it with skill." Ultimately, Robinson was an excellent scholar who seems to have been appreciated by at least some of his students. He deserves credit for orchestrating those early travel scholarships. Even so, it is an uncomfortable fact of history that Robinson's time at Knox College is overshadowed by his interactions at the formal dedication in 1915. Robinson's Americanness seems to have been a problem both when he was hired in 1896 and in 1915 when he defended American neutrality in a room full of Canadians. Notwithstanding the criticisms against Robinson, we should be grateful for what his autobiography teaches us about this period in Knox College's history. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Robert. And thank you for both of our panelists. We're going to just take a stretch now, and not stretch in just metaphoric, like just move your arms or whatever. And we're going to move into the question and answers. And I think, I'm just trying to see, I think Junwan is going to help monitor the question and answers. And Robert will as well. But Robert, you, I know, are going to be more involved in trying to answer any questions that are directed to you. So if there are questions, MJ, you have a question for Robert. So I'm going to go to MJ Perry to begin with. And MJ, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your paper, Robert. It was fascinating. I'm not as familiar with my college's history as perhaps I should be. I'm wondering though, what was the relationship of Knox College with the University of Toronto at that time? And what was its position on academic freedom and the right of professors?
Stuart can probably answer that question with more authority than I can, but I know that the Knox had, there was some overlap between Knox faculty and the theological faculty at University College. And I don't think Knox was a part of the University of Toronto in the same way it is now, though. I don't know if I'm right or not, Stuart, but.
So it's a great question, and let me answer it. No, it was part, but in a different way. In some ways, it was more integrated in, but in other ways, funding-wise and otherwise, it wouldn't. I think the other thing to remember, though, is if we just zoom out for a second, my recollection and understanding is at the University of Toronto, several faculty members were fired over war issues. They were German. And so this idea of academic freedom, we just need to be careful. When war comes along, and somebody may know U of T's history better than me, but that's my recollection, is that within the university community, any unpopular views would have been punished. And so what happened at Knox is more indicative of a broader cultural thing than specifically associated with Knox. And my recollection is there were firings from, or people let go from the German faculty, or questions of loyalty, having anyone who was German on faculty at the time. So it was a very intense period.
Thank you. It was a great paper. Thank you very much.
Other questions?
Stuart, Clyde here. I was going to say, perhaps one way of answering the question would be to take note of whether or not back in 1896, presumably, every professor at Knox College would have been approved by the General Assembly. At least it seems that way from the paper that Robert gave, which suggests to me that it was more self-consciously a denominational college, somewhat separate from the university, at least at one level, than it would be now. Is that a fair comment?
Yes. Other questions?
Yeah, and I was just going to say that the other thing too is that the controversy that I talked about happened long after he had taught at Knox as well, so that also may have contributed to the dynamic, because Knox was giving him an honorary degree, but he hadn't been formally affiliated with the college for 17 years at that point.
John, I think you have a question.
Well, I was just going to make one comment talking about academic freedom. So cancel culture existed back then, but I think even at U of T a bit later, there was the Frank Underhill case, and he was considered to be a bit too far to the left politically and was given a hard time. I can't remember the details, but this has gone on for a long time. But the other, I'm just going to ask Robert, you mentioned Robinson's autobiography. Are you familiar also with a book that he wrote toward the end of his life called Live Out Your Years? And it's very relevant to people like me because it's about retirement. And he talks about when should one retire, signs of approaching old age after 70, death, home and heaven, all kinds of, it's kind of a devotional book, a bit autobiographical. I wonder if you're familiar with that book. Maybe it's not in the Knox Library either.
I didn't come into contact with it for this research, but
Okay.
it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Other questions? You can put a question in chat, or MJ, you have a question for Angus. You need to unmute. Sorry about that.
I'm sorry to be so, but I love both papers. I just found them very exciting. Angus, when, unfortunately I did get a bit confused because the Nortons, like all Scottish families, give everyone the same name. But did John Norton, who was the one who became the leader of the Six Nations, he was the one, if I heard it properly, was raised in Scotland, even though he was born in Canada and was Indigenous himself. But if he had been raised in Scotland, where did he get the opportunity to learn all the native languages that he did? Like, I can understand how he would learn the European languages that he knew. And also, how would he be sufficiently knowledgeable about some of the cultural things that he was able to negotiate and just be as good a liaison as he was between the cultures? It was fascinating and intriguing and all that stuff.
Well, let me correct you at the first. The one who was brought from the States was the father of John Norton, Deonan Hokaroen. John Norton, the one I was speaking about, is the second one. He was born in Scotland. He was taught some of the Cherokee language by his father. When he came to Canada as a teenager, because he had learned some of those languages, he got very deeply involved in the First Nations culture in Canada. It's not clear how or when he learned to speak German, for example, which was one of the European languages. But he spoke the languages of the Six Nations. He spoke Cherokee and apparently some Ojibwe and some of the other First Nations languages in Ontario. All of this surrounding the time heading into the War of 1812.
Okay.
A little clearer?
Yes, thank you very much. Again, another great paper. I really love them both. Thank you.
Other questions for either presenter?
Clyde here, Stuart.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by the fact that both papers, and both of them were, I agree, excellently done. Both happen to tramp upon the sensitivities between Canada and the States. And I think of that as a sort of modern thing, but obviously it goes back a long, long time. And the way in which perhaps unknowingly American honesty, or what others might call brashness, got people into trouble both at the border and at Knox College. But I just find it interesting, the sort of dynamics illustrated across that international border in both these papers.
So Angus, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Timothy Willig writing from an American university and Carl Benn writing from a Canadian university, both are completely in agreement that that John Norton really believed the only hope for the First Nations lay within the realm of the British help. They saw the Americans as being far too expansionist, far too hard on the peoples. And those Haudenosaunee that fought in the War of 1812 on the American side both agree that they were basically forced into it. And I think they chose that in order to try to discourage the Haudenosaunee fighting on the British side because they wouldn't want to fight against their own brothers. However, that kind of thing did happen. It was very, both show John Norton and Joseph Brant and the majority of the Haudenosaunee anyway as being primarily pro-British.
Robert, did you want to comment on that?
I mean, I would agree with the observation. I did actually find it interesting that when the controversy arose over Robinson's hiring, he was the one who they did hire, but it was the British candidate or candidate coming from Britain who was not hired. Because Knox had certainly had brought in a lot of faculty from Scotland, both before and after Robinson. And then in the case of his remarks in 1915, as much as the way Robinson paints it in his autobiography, he really should have known better in the political climate that he was in, even if he had those views, just to blame the Allies as being equally at fault in the war while the war is going on. I don't know what response he would have expected when he made those statements. Yeah.
And yet, Robert, although the Knox College turned down a British candidate for the other position, they clearly identified themselves politically with the British Empire, as opposed to this American neutrality. So I just find it interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? I have one, but I just don't want to dominate. Robert, you mentioned that he was a pacifist, and I just want to explore that for a second. And I'm sure that's how he's being portrayed in the literature. Well, what was he a pacifist in that he was opposed to war under all circumstances, or was he just challenging this particular war and suggesting there were faults on both sides?
My take from reading it is that he was I mean, I guess it's hard to say for sure, but he seems to have been just a pacifist opposed to all war.
Okay, because that's a really fascinating question about what was going on at the First World War, because we often talk about people leaving a pacifist position, but the Presbyterians in Canada had more of a just war position before the war. That's what I would argue, and I think a few other scholars would see. And we've been reading back that once we got to war, though, the support for the British Empire was really pretty overwhelming. And that was true not only the Presbyterian Church in Canada, but as you've illustrated, from Canadian society as a whole. And I think that really is something for us to remember, is how strong it was and what people were willing to ignore in terms of the way that the war was being waged. And that's some of the stuff that some of the more recent literature has raised questions about some of the things that the British Empire did. And if we were to hear those in other situations other than that it's our side, we might go, is stopping food getting to civilian populations, is that a problem or not? And so what struck me more was it seemed to me to be more in a, I was surprised that the controversy was as early as it was. I thought he would have been raising this more a few years later when the casualties were higher. So that, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but that was my sense of that there was just so much cultural angst about this and so much opposition.
Well, the thing that I found actually most surprising was how the American newspapers were just as critical of him as the Canadian newspapers. I found at the time, and it was actually quite striking. And of course, he mentioned getting the telegram from the mayor of Chicago saying that he should be interned. So I was actually surprised by how close some of the American views aligned with the Canadian, even before the United States was participating in the war.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I had missed that, so I appreciate that. MJ, you wanted to follow up with a question.
Yeah, well, because of what Stuart asked, I was wondering, Robert, what were his views on the United States entering? I don't recall you mentioning that. I hope I didn't miss it. When they did enter the war, what were his views then, or do we know?
He doesn't really say too much about that I remember from the autobiography, though I'd have to check again to be sure. But
so you think it was a real pacifist view and not just a nationalist sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's if the U.S. had already been in the war in 1915, it would be interesting to know whether he would have made the same statements. But I think he was committed to pacifism.
Okay, thank you.
That's good. Any other questions? Well, if not, what I'm going to suggest we do is invite everyone to unmute for a moment. We're going to applaud our two speakers, and then I'll give the instructions for the next thing to do. But let's thank our speakers first of all. Again, I want to just thank everyone who's been involved behind the scenes in putting this on, Ian and Sid, and then of course, Junwan and Robert, who are serving as co-hosts. In the next section, we have our roles all kind of set out. And so I am now actually going to pass it over to Robert and start working on sharing the screen to get ready for Rebecca's presentation. So if I could, Robert, turn it over to you.
Good afternoon to everyone. In a moment, we'll be starting our third presentation of the day from the Reverend Rebecca Jess. And Rebecca is one of two ministers at Armour Heights Presbyterian Church in Toronto, where she has served for 2 years. Previous to completing her MDiv at Knox College, Rebecca was the director of the Cairn family of camps, a set of Presbyterian summer camps in Muskoka. It's not surprising then that her current work and historical interests very often include and focus on children, youth, and families. Under normal circumstances, this is the part where I think Rebecca would walk to the front of the stage and people would clap. But since we can't quite do that, we will pass it over to Rebecca to begin her presentation.
Great, thanks very much, Robert. And so appropriate that there were so many people talking about camp just before we started this section, because my background is very much camp as well. And we'll talk a little bit about camp today too. So you can move to the next slide. Thank you. The Presbyterian Church in Canada prior to Church Union in 1925 boasted very high numbers in their programs for children and young people. To give some examples, the reported numbers from the Board of Sabbath Schools and Young People Societies for 1924 includes over 33,000 children in the cradle roll, over 4,100 young people's organizations, and over 6,600 who came into full communion. The budget was high, over $100,000. The life and work related to children and young people looked very promising, with many thousands being involved in one program or another across the country. These numbers would not be so impressive, though, in the following year's report. The decision of many to leave the Presbyterian Church in favor of church union and the creation of the United Church in Canada left the anti-unionist Presbyterian Church members in a place of uncertainty and great change. However, in the years following church union, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, as we well know, did not close itself down. It went immediately into a mode of rebuilding and restoring. This was true in many areas of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, including the restoration of its programming for youth. The PCC recognized the need to continue to grow and to place a good deal of development into their young people, particularly because they were the people needed to carry the church into the future. The 1925 union left the Presbyterian Church with very few resources. Materials were scarce. There was very little in terms of office equipment and supplies. The church had also lost its records relating to this area, so it was difficult for the newly appointed Board of Sabbath Schools and Young People's Societies to make comparisons and statements in terms of growth. On top of this, they had lost many of their teachers, officers, and students. Next slide, please. Despite these setbacks, the PCC made the decision to move forward and gain momentum in whatever way possible. While youth programs could have been set to the side while other areas were given greater focus and rebuilding efforts, the church made it a priority to appoint new members to the Board of Sabbath Schools and Young People's Societies and to continue with the faith formation, education, and training of its young people. Through growth within the 10 years subsequent to church union in 1925, although growth within those 10 years was slow, the youth of the PCC were successfully taught two of the primary aims of the Presbyterian Church at that time. The first being what it means to be Presbyterian, and the second, what it means to be Canadian. You can move to the next slide, please. More than ever, the PCC had a strong desire to raise and train young people in a manner that helped them to feel a deep sense of pride for both their denomination and their country. Their success with this aim stems from the efforts of the Board of Sabbath Schools and Young People's Societies, print publications, including magazines and books, and a focus on both retaining and further developing youth leadership through specific programs and camps. So a little bit about the Board of Sabbath Schools and Young People's Societies, which I will also refer to as the Board of SS and YPS. Appointed in June of 1925 after the division of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, the newly arranged Board of Sabbath Schools and Young People's Societies included 10 executive members who, and I quote the Acts and Proceedings from 1926 here, began the work of reorganization with great enthusiasm. One may wonder about the veracity of such a statement after the loss of so many materials, records, leaders, and students. But there is little doubt from this report in 1926 that they put forward a strong effort to bring programming, events, and training back to life within the church. We'll explore a bit today the specific ways that this board, as a committed and dedicated sect of the greater church, did not allow for its youth to be left behind in the wake of a divided church. Next slide. In their 1928 report in Acts and Proceedings, the Board of SS and YPS aptly articulate their desire for youth within the church to be trained today for the sake of the future. And I quote here, "For what the church will be in the course of a few years depends upon the kind of men and women the boys and girls of today become. In the ordinary course of events, almost every important position in the church and state will have been vacated within 25 or 30 years. These positions must be filled by those who are in training today. It's ours to make that training as thorough and complete as possible. The state provides trained leaders for our schools and colleges. but those institutions do not provide an all-round education. To the home and church, we must look for the cultivation of the devotional and spiritual life of the rising generation. So how did they meet this goal? One way was through publications. As I mentioned, after Union in 1925, the board of SS and YPS determined to provide publications that were both Presbyterian and Canadian. While rebuilding, they received lesson planning and teaching materials in conjunction with the Presbyterian Church USA. But it was important for the board and the teachers and ministers across the Presbyterian Church in Canada that eventually materials be from a Canadian perspective. Being in a growing nation with a large influx of immigrants, it was important for the PCC to help define what it meant to be Canadian through Canadian stories and through a push for Canada to be Protestant, and even better, Presbyterian. Through Canadian Presbyterian publications, the Board of SS and YPS could encourage the faith formation of young people while also promoting Presbyterianism and national pride. Next slide. One of the greatest hurdles to this publication goal was money. There was little in the budget to help start up publications. The best way to fund a publication was to use a subscription income to help pay for it, but of course, there were no subscriptions until there was a publication. The board focused its efforts on creating just one publication to begin with, The Challenge. The Challenge was a magazine made for seniors and young people, or in other words, for teenagers and young adults. Its first quarterly publication came out in October 1929. It was 8 pages long and resembled a newspaper in style. A number of people across the denomination worked to write sections of the publication and edit it all together. Next slide. Its purpose, as stated in this first edition, stated, "To every high and noble service for Christ and the Church, the Challenge will seek to call the youth of the Presbyterian Church in Canada." And in the board report in Acts and Proceedings in 1930, it said, "The purpose of this magazine is to give help to leaders and members of teenage girls and boys groups and young people's societies." The first page listed a series of very short stories, some biblical in nature, where someone was challenged in the way that they followed Jesus. Its final challenge was as follows: "Our church, its life, its work, its great future, calls out young people to devote their lives to Jesus Christ and to train themselves for his service." Challenge. It was clear that the board intended to use this publication as a means to help teach and train its readers to be committed in their service to Christ and to their church. The publication included a variety of articles, information, and a Bible study section. The Bible study section included weekly scriptures for each of the 3 months the magazine covered, quiz questions based on that quarter's lessons, a biblically themed puzzle, and a short story related to the overall theme. While there were some general interest stories and articles in the Challenge, it seemed that the more pressing interest of its contributors and editors was to encourage young people to institute young people societies within their churches and help train leaders to run those societies. An article in the very first issue of the Challenge gave instructions on how to organize a PYPS in a church and provided information on how to obtain topic cards from the board of SS and YPS that will provide program information and ideas related to devotional, missionary, literary, and social activities for a PYPS to use. While the magazine did recognize that these topic cards may not apply to every group across Canada, their use was still greatly encouraged. This was especially the case since the idea of Presbyterian young people societies was that they were organized and run by young people. As quoted in the Challenge, "The best program will be one that has been freely discussed and adopted by the young people themselves." The magazine also encouraged youth to write in with questions, difficulties, or concerns that they, as the PYPS leaders, were facing in order to receive answers and suggestions within the pages of the following quarterly issue of the Challenge. The magazine wanted to be a worthwhile resource to youth that subscribed to it. Next slide. Oh, yeah, there we go. Good. Along with being a useful resource, the challenge was also ready to continue instilling its readers with information about being Presbyterian. A trivia column took the kind of information you might find in a General Assembly statistics report and listed that information with a "Did you know" heading, presumably with the hope that if the material was presented in an interesting way, then the youth would actually read and retain it. A "For Discussion" section graced its pages too, listing a series of questions that would encourage its readers to vision for themselves. Questions included, what are some of the things for which many young people strive? Are they most worthwhile? These questions were then connected to biblical dreamers and visionaries like Joseph, Moses, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. This was not meant to be a magazine for sheer entertainment, but a resource to help train and prepare readers to be intelligent thinkers and visionaries within the life of the Presbyterian Church. The only major complaint about the challenge was that it was only offered quarterly. From its conception, the board of SS and YPS and the magazine's editors worked to gain subscriptions so that eventually the magazine would arrive monthly. In just 3 years, the board reached this goal, and the challenge was started afresh in January of 1932 as a monthly magazine. This revamped version of the magazine comes across as less like a spiced up variation on General Assembly reports and more like what one might expect from a magazine for youth, with greater focus on entertaining articles about Canadians, life in Canada, and the work of Presbyterian missionaries. This presentation was more distinctly a human interest format than the previous articles in the challenge, which arguably came across as general information more than human interest articles or stories of the faithful. The new version of the challenge included fictional stories that were distinctly Canadian, as well as illustrations and photos to enhance both the stories and articles. There was a new section called My Canada that focused on the history of a specific city or town in Canada each month. Of course, faith-based material was still important to the aims of the challenge, so a new section entitled "'Neath Nathaniel's Fig Tree" was instituted. Rather than offering a series of weekly scriptures, the magazine now had the space and opportunity to select a few themes or topics and more deeply explore them. A section made for PYPS leaders was still included, though it resembled less of a plea for young people to start organizing PYPSs in their churches, as had existed in the previous incarnation of the challenge. Now the YPS topic section provided discussion starters and devotionals related to a biblical theme that could be used at meetings. The challenge also continued to offer sections for girls and boys separately. The titles of these sections changed over the following years, but there was always space dedicated to the cultural interests and programs offered for specific genders. Despite the fact that the challenge came out during the Depression years, subscriptions continued to rise and the magazine was found in more and more homes across Canada. In fact, an ad within the final 1931 issue of the original challenge called to all youth, wanted 20,000 Presbyterian young people to become readers of the challenge. While statistics do not reflect that subscriptions anywhere near that figure were accumulated, it is noteworthy that the publication managed to move from being a quarterly magazine in 1929 to being a monthly magazine with an increased number of subscriptions by 1932. That said, the magazine itself was not against posting ads for itself within its pages. One advertisement in its January 1932 issue included the following statement: "Your loyalty to Canada and to the Presbyterian Church demands that your Sunday school subscribe for the challenge." The board of SS and YPS stood behind their work in the challenge and wanted all Presbyterian Canadians to be familiar with the magazine and get behind it as well. Publications were only one way of engaging youth and encouraging their understanding of faith, Presbyterianism, and what it means to be a Protestant Canadian. But one of the major features of the challenge in particular was that it not only promoted denominational and national pride, but also specific programs offered within or alongside the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Church programs were not meant as merely entertaining ways to engage youth and keep them occupied. Church programs were an intentional part of youth development and placed leadership and faith-forming demands on its participants. A great deal of pressure was placed on youth to join youth programs or become leaders within youth programs. After the loss connected with church union, it was important for the Presbyterian Church to bolster its youth programs and find ways to both grow the overall numbers and train the youth to be faithful, dedicated members of the denomination. Next slide. In their 1926 report, the Board of SS and YPS stated that they have given very special attention to the work amongst our young people, and that the board unanimously agreed that a society founded on the principles of the Christian endeavor would best meet our needs. In other words, the board recognized that there were organizations that focused on the intellectual and athletic needs of youth, but the church's role would be to fill the distinct function of spiritual development. And while there were some youth programs already in place across the country, in particular CGIT, or Canadian Girls in Training groups, there was still, and I quote, considerable demand for some modification of the Constitution that will make the training of these boys and girls more distinctly Presbyterian. In the 10 years following church union, the Presbyterian Church, through the Board of Sabbath Schools and Young People's Societies, pushed for greater membership in its existing programs, namely Young People's Societies, and put new youth-based training and programs into motion. Young People's Societies were an important part of youth leadership development and faith formation within the PCC. Immediately following church union, there was a much lower number of Young People's Societies across the country. As the Presbyterian Church worked to reorganize itself within those first few years after union, it appeared that no matter how much it was encouraged, there was little change in numbers within Young People's Societies. The Board of SS and YPS made it clear in their reports that this was not because young people were choosing not to be a part of the church. On the contrary, as the church slowly reorganized, they chose to get involved in whatever other areas of the church life they could, including mission band, young ladies auxiliary, Sabbath school teachers, members of organized Bible classes, and choir. While this information appeared to please the Presbyterian Church in general, it was the aim of the Board of SS and YPS to not give up on rallying the youth into PYPS groups within their churches or geographical areas. Having a singular body of youth following the same kinds of meeting plans, leadership opportunities, and faith development was important to the future of the Presbyterian Church. The church needed to be unified in its vision of faith, worship, and mission goals. Without PYPS to help with the unification of youth, the future of the church would be at greater risk of becoming divided in its understandings and beliefs, which no one wanted to see after the turmoil that division had already caused for the church. On top of this, the board sincerely believed that the Young People's Societies should have a real place in the training of the future membership of the church. And the most important aspect of that training need to be the cultivation of devotional and spiritual life through Bible study. Their 1928 report states that the society that does not place that book, in the very heart of its program is doomed to failure. For those within a local PYPS in 1927, the Board of SS and YPS issued topic cards that was based on the Christian Endeavor program and included 2 study books, The Royal Road, which detailed the stories of Presbyterian missionaries and was published by the Women's Missionary Society, and Presbyterianism, which was a series of sermons written by Dr. R.W. Dickey. It is evident from the selection of these study books that the board wanted to use them as resources that would encourage a greater understanding and appreciation of the particularities of being Presbyterians, including knowledge of history and doctrines, and the missional work that the church was doing in Canada and overseas. This theme continued over the years with annual reports outlining the study books that were suggested for the use of members in the PYPS. In all cases, the study books focused on some form of Presbyterianism, history or doctrine, and stories of Presbyterian missionaries working in Canada or in foreign countries. At the time of their report in 1931, the membership within PYPS groups had begun to grow more steadily, perhaps with the help of the challenge, and annual or semi-annual PYPS rallies were being held in a number of presbyteries. The board also continued to stress to the denomination that every congregation should work towards having a PYPS in order to instruct and train its young people because, and I quote, "From its ranks should come workers for every other organization in the congregation." Their diligent work and tireless efforts to increase the number of young people's societies across Canada provided some hope for the future of the church. Within 10 years of church union, the number of young people's societies increased, as did the number of youth involved in them. Where in 1926, only 448 PYPSs were reported, by 1935, there were 611. While the Board of SS and YPS and the Presbyterian Church at large likely hoped for far greater numbers, their efforts did lead to a 36% increase over 10 years, or 163 newly established PYPSs. Considering other areas of the church, including numbers in Sabbath schools, saw both increases and decreases over that time, it seems quite appropriate for the church to celebrate the fact that their work with and for the young people's societies made a notable impact. While numbers and statistics played a key role in tracking the growth and change in the church post-union, what would not be as clearly tracked over 10 years, but likely had a strong impact on the Presbyterian Church overall, was the fact that each of those young people who participated in PYPS received intentional and thoughtful faith formation, as well as leadership opportunities and a real chance to have a voice in the church, both present and into the future. The Presbyterian Church was not looking to silence its youth into submission, but looking to give them a real place and set of tasks within the work of the church. This, I would argue, is a more impressive objective than simply trying to increase numbers. As well as having young people's societies, the Presbyterian Church in Canada had supported a few other programs for young people. Some of this programming was ecumenical, such as CGIT and Boy Scouts. And the Board of SS and YPS felt these groups met the needs of its youth, but also wished to further enrich their ecumenical and Sabbath school experiences with training that was more distinctly Presbyterian. As such, in 1928, the Board of SS and YPS reported the publication of 2 small pamphlets to assist leaders in starting up Presbyterian programming for teenage boys and girls. These pamphlets were actually named Program Suggestions for Teenage Girls and Program Suggestions for Teenage Boys, and were sent to every minister and Sabbath school superintendent in the autumn of 1927. The Board of SS and YPS hoped these pamphlets would act as a kind of constitution to create some uniformity in the organizations being created for young people across the country. Though copies of these pamphlets no longer exist, it can be presumed that they placed a good deal of focus on Bible-based lessons and discussions and Presbyterian doctrine. Girls' programming grew fairly quickly across the denomination. As of 1927, the church established a dedicated secretary of girls' work who visited girls' groups in congregations, presbyteries, synods, and girls' camps across the country. With this role, the girls' organizations had a reliable source to call on for extra help, resources, encouragement, and support. This half-time position was funded by the Women's Missionary Society, so on top of having the support of the Board of SS and YPS, it also had the established support of the WMS to back it up. By 1935, there were 480 registered girls' organizations in churches across the country. Young women were not only provided Bible studies, but also taught how to be leaders in Christian education and were encouraged to go through deaconess training. Much of their programming also centered on missionary education and encouraged camp programming and training. In fact, girls' work was considered important enough that the girls' work secretary, Edith Sinclair, was given the opportunity to lead a talk with the graduating class of 1935 at Presbyterian College in Montreal. Next slide. The challenge featured a girls' work section, which included program ideas and outlines for girls' groups, general interest articles, short stories, book suggestions, and a problem corner, where leaders could write in with their questions, challenges, and issues and receive answers and suggestions from Aunt Solver. While girls' organizations seemed to flourish, the boys' organizations were strangely absent post-union. While there were a variety of ecumenical programs offered for teenage boys, it wasn't until 1929 that a distinctly Presbyterian program was started. Called the Order of the Burning Bush, The program was designed for ages 12 to 18 and was meant to encourage the organization of teenage boys in every Presbyterian congregation throughout the Dominion. Groups were to meet as regularly as possible, and its aims involved the whole life of the boy developed toward Christian discipleship, and to have every boy trained in reverence, loyalty, and service. After the initiation of this program, the board of SS and YPS petitioned for a dedicated boys' work secretary in order to help train and direct the leaders of the Order of the Burning Bush. In August of 1929, a boys' work secretary was employed under the appointment of the board. However, due to health problems, the secretary had to resign less than a year later, and the board was at first unable to fill the position and then unable to afford the position, leaving it unfilled into 1935 and beyond. In order to try and help the Order of the Burning Bush succeed as much as possible without a boys' work secretary to help guide it, the challenge offered an entire page devoted to boys' work. This section encouraged readers to form their own Burning Bush order with explanations on how to organize, information about programming guides, and suggested devotionals, intellectual activities, and physical activities. The boys' work section of the challenge also included general interest articles, particularly around the theme of how to achieve success and why boys should consider going into ministry, and suggested hobbies for boys, which included everything from stamp collecting to boy scientist. While the board of SS and YPS put an honest effort to help the Order of the Burning Bush to take off as a program for teenage boys in the PCC, without a dedicated secretary to fortify the program, it was not nearly as successful as the girls' weeknight programs. That said, the Young People's Society was still an option for teenage boys to become a part of, so boys were certainly not forgotten during this time. While year-round programs and publications were key to building and maintaining both the faith lives and faith organizations of Presbyterian young people, there was also a great deal of emphasis placed on summer camps and summer training programs. Post-Union, the Presbyterian Church in Canada wasted no time in putting together summer training and camp programs. We'll move to the next slide. In 1929, Knox College hosted a week-long training camp that included Bible studies, training classes related to leading Sunday school for a variety of age groups, and daily outings to places in and around Toronto, including the provincial parliament, the zoo, and a sail to Toronto Island. Similar camps were held in other areas of the country as well, Keats Island in British Columbia being a notable location for many years. The camps were used as a place, especially in the years immediately following Church Union, to do model meetings of the Young People's Society in order to persuade more youth to join. In the first issue of the challenge, the outcome of the camp at Knox College was described as follows. With higher ideals of Christian service and deepened purpose and holy consecration, these young people of our church have returned to their congregations filled with that enthusiasm which will carry forward the work of our church to greater success. The camp's focus was on more than fun and fellowship, and even more than just Bible study. They were an intensive training ground for future leaders of the Presbyterian Church. According to the challenge in 1930, prior to June 1925, very few Presbyterian summer schools were held in Canada. Since then, the number has gradually increased. This comment could be readily made after the summer of 1930, when the Presbyterian Church in Canada had been able to offer 2 more camps in Ontario at their own dedicated, not rented locations, Glenmore on Lake Simcoe and Kintail on Lake Huron. These were added to the property already owned and operated for summer camp training programs on Lake George in Sault Ste. Marie. On top of this, by 1930, almost every synod across Canada was offering some sort of training camp, PYPS camp, girls camp, and/or boys camp. Editions of the challenge that came out in 1932 provided a great deal of information about and stories from summer camps. The playful joys of summer camp were accented, as well as the leadership opportunities they proffered. Summer camp could also be seen as a uniquely Canadian and Presbyterian experience. Faith formation in the wilderness. In the closing report of 1926, the Board of SS and YPS stated their hope that the year that lies before us be one of consolidation and progress. It is the earnest desire of all that a flourishing Sabbath school and young people's society should be found in every congregation, they said. While the board likely imagined this desire to become a reality more quickly and substantially than the actual outcome, it can be said that in the 10 years following church union, the Board of SS and YPS made strong headway with its desire to prepare the future leaders of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Setting numbers aside, the church could take heart in the fact that the youth who were participating in Presbyterian programming and who were reading The Challenge were being provided a uniquely Presbyterian faith formation that would affect their individual futures as well as the future of the church. The efforts of the Board of Sabbath Schools and Young People's Societies saw growth and change in their youth and successfully set the standard and a foundation in its youth programming and publications for the years following 1935 as well. While numbers may not have grown at a staggering rate, it can be said that the in-house publications and focus on youth programs really helped to mold a generation of youth who could truly identify themselves as both Presbyterian and Canadian. Thank you.
Thank you to Rebecca for that presentation. Our next presentation is by Stuart McDonald. Many of you probably know Stuart already, but Stuart serves as professor of church and society at Knox College, where he has taught Presbyterian history for over 20 years. He has researched and written on a variety of topics in Canadian Presbyterian history, including World War I, ethnicity, and the response to Vatican II. He's currently working on a book on the Presbyterian Church in Canada in the post-World War II period. And we'll throw it over to Stuart now.
Apologies, I was muted in two different ways. So I got one and I failed in the other. So let me go back and start the screen share again and start the PowerPoint. So everyone can hear me now? All good? Okay. As you can see, this is the topic I want to speak to, or the question I want to address: protest or loyalty, the background to the Declaration of Faith concerning church and nation. We've all been taught what happened. Canadian Presbyterians were watching what was going on in Europe. They saw the church stand that the confessing Christians in Germany took in the Barmen Declaration. They were inspired. This led to the Paris Deliverance, which ultimately created the Declaration of Faith concerning church and nation. The Paris Deliverance is named after the Presbytery of Paris, just to be clear, not the French city. This allowed our denomination, for the first time since its creation in 1875, to have a united stance on the church-state relations issues, resolving the compromise that was built into the formation of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, wherein one was allowed full liberty of conscience on this important issue. Canadian Presbyterians could now speak with one voice, and it was a voice that was ultimately one of protest, where the church could take the state to task when it defied what the church believed was essential to the gospel. As noted, this is the story we tell ourselves, but it's more complicated than this, and some aspects of our telling of this story are a little misleading. What I want to do in this presentation is to go over what I've discovered were some of the factors in the origins of the Declaration. This is a topic I stumbled upon, not one I intentionally set out to explore. I was asked to write an introduction to Living Faith, 1984, setting that confession in its historical context. And in doing that, I was interested in the simple question: what took Canadian Presbyterians so long to produce a contemporary statement of faith? The United Church of Canada had produced statements of faith in this period in 1940 and again in 1968. Presbyterians, though, didn't succeed. So that's what I was interested in. But in the process, I discovered more. And this is one of the things I'll be discussing today. And this will eventually form part of a larger discussion on theological developments in the post-Union Presbyterian Church in Canada. So let's go back to 1925. During the debates about church union, the Westminster Confession of Faith became one of the points around which those opposed to the 1925 church union project rallied. Throughout his book, written shortly after that crucial moment, Ephraim Scott made the case that one of the things which was central to the Presbyterian Church in Canada was the Westminster Standards. For our purposes, there are two things I think we need to recognize. First, this appeal to the creedal purity of the Presbyterian Church in Canada in its adherence to the Westminster Confession reinforced the arguments made under the Overton case in terms of the original doctrine and purpose of a church. In a sense, these arguments, arguing for the PCC and its adherence to the Westminster Standards as proof that it was the real legitimate Presbyterian voice, these arguments were playing to the courts, in particular as a way of securing the property. However, once you've made them, they take on a life of their own. And for me, this is the second important point. Rhetoric sometimes becomes reality. Changing these doctrinal positions or the language in which they were expressed became more problematic after 1925 than would have been the case in the decades before. Ephraim Scott, 3 years after Union, catalogs the needs of the new church. And one thing Scott argues the church doesn't need is any change to its doctrine, to quote him. Nor does the Presbyterian Church need, as was so often heard in the 20 years conflict, a new theology or creed, a new system of doctrine or religious belief and teaching. For that to which he now stands pledged is the unchanging truth of God's word as truth is summed up in her tried and tested standards, the Westminster Confessions and Catechisms, which she accepts and adopts, not because others in the past have accepted them, but because she believes them to be founded on and agreeable to the word of God. In the course of the church union debates, continuing Presbyterians had tied themselves closer to the Westminster Confession of Faith with only two places where liberty of conscience was granted, church and state, and who one might marry. Indeed, the denomination may have been more closely tied after 1925 than it was in 1905. And there was thus no need for any committee of the church to exist that would focus on doctrinal issues. This seeming consensus broke down or seems to have broken down during World War II. The General Assembly in 1942 is crucial. It was at this assembly that two overtures related to church and state were received, as well as a memorial from the Presbytery of Paris. The latter is not actually printed in the Axton proceedings. Overture 18 from the Synod of Hamilton and London, which included the Presbytery of Paris, addressed the issue of the civil magistrate. The overture contended that the existing situation, that is a lack of clarity around church and state in how one accepted the Westminster Confession, was a challenge to many to, quote, affirm their loyalty to the state, and the state on its part is left without assured knowledge of its powers and duties under the lordship of Jesus Christ towards the church. Overture 24 from the Presbytery of Toronto was much longer and different in substance. In essence, the complaint of this overture was that the state was calling its own worship services during the war. And there was one particular issue problematic for Presbyterians, to quote from the overture. The forms of religious worship prepared for these services and the prayers suggested for use in them which are prepared with a view to include Protestants and Catholics, Jew and Gentile, in one religious act, and which therefore do not confess Jesus Christ, but are notable for the omission of all reference to his name. The drafters of the overture raised questions of church and state that arose out of this situation, asking if the church could call, the state, could call the church to such worship. Talking about responsibility of the church to the state, asking who in the church was supporting this, those kinds of things, and the approval, and who was approving services which were, quote, notable in their failure to confess Jesus Christ. Because both of these overtures raised timely issues of church and state, they were put together, and a special committee was sent away to report back to the 1942 Assembly. Given that it seemed to raise similar concerns, the memorial, the petition or deliverance, what Paris Presbytery did is referred to in a variety of ways. It also ends up with that committee. And you can see the title of it there. In response to these diverse and challenging issues, the special committee came back to that assembly with the suggestion, no action be taken. But assembly disagreed and formed a committee to study these issues. So note there were multiple concerns about church and state, not just those voiced in the Paris deliverance. And for those who are interested, the text of the deliverance, though it is not published in the Acts and Proceedings, does exist in this little booklet that was published by Gordon Petty, which not only has the document, but lots of commentary on it. At the next year's assembly in 1943, the special committee reported. The concerns of Overture 24 were readily dealt with. The moderator, Dr. Norman MacLeod, was present at this meeting and reported on a meeting he and leaders from 3 other Protestant denominations had with the Prime Minister in Ottawa. This is what Dr. MacLeod reported, that they were very cordially received by the Prime Minister, and assurance was given by him that while in the past there had been sent out forms of worship for special services which were admittedly unsatisfactory, the name of Jesus Christ having been nowhere mentioned in at least one of them, the same thing would not happen again, and that church leaders would be consulted when such forms were being prepared in the future. The Prime Minister said he fully recognized the place of the church in the national life. Report continued that there was considerable discussion on church-state relations that took place, including the position that the church might find itself in, quote, if at any time a government unfriendly to the church might arise in Canada, end quote, given that the church considered Christians to have dual citizenship as citizens of the state as well as members of the church, yet no resolution was recorded. That's the morning. After lunch, the committee considered the overture from Hamilton and the petition and how this related to the Westminster Confession of Faith. The discussion was recorded as being wide-ranging, dealing not only with the presenting issue, but broader issues of the Westminster Confession, its place in the church, and the relationship between scripture and confessions, and larger theological questions. In the end, the committee agreed on 3 things. First, it was not the time to look at church and state issues, as any pronouncements would lead to, quote, misunderstanding and confusion. But then, number 2, these issues needed to be looked at in terms of all of the theological issues which required study. And their third point, therefore, a special committee recommended the establishment of a larger committee comprised of the ablest men in the church, that's their words, who would be given the task of re-examining our whole confessional position as a church with a view to eventually stating what we believe as a Reformed church in language and concepts relevant to our day and situation, end quote. And with seemingly little debate, the recommendations of the special committee were adopted, and continuing Presbyterians for the first time since 1925 found themselves with the committee mandated to consider theology and doctrine. The special committee on overtures number 18 and 24 and petition from the Presbytery of Paris 1942 organized themselves and set about the task they'd been assigned. This is an important story, all of the documents they produced. But for our purposes today, the key is, after working to create contemporary statements of what the church believed on various doctrinal issues, they ran into a snag, the doctrine of predestination. The committee itself was divided. In 1948, this section was presented to the Assembly with an important dissent included as well, appended to the report. The dissent was by Dr. William Stanford Reed, and he protested that the committee's work went beyond its mandate because the statement was, quote, definitely not the doctrine held by the Westminster Confession of Faith, end quote, and further dissented that the proposed section was, quote, anti-reformed and rejects the historic position of Presbyterianism. Not surprisingly, debate ensued when the report was presented to the General Assembly. Reed attempted to amend the standard motion to send the report back down to study and comment by the presbyteries. He proposed instead that it be sent back to the committee with a strong reminder that the Westminster Confession of Faith is still the statement of this church's faith, and further that the committee's report not be printed in the proceedings of the Assembly. This amendment failed. Instead, the committee was reminded of its mandate, but the report was printed and distributed. The divisions within the committee continued even after the resignation of William Stanford Reed and F. Scott Mackenzie preceding the 1949 Assembly. Whether a contemporary statement of faith might have been produced despite these divisions had things continued remains unclear. An overture to the 1949 Assembly permanently changed the committee's work and deliberations. The overture from the Presbytery of Montreal, Overture 18, Read Church and State, that appeared before the 49 Assembly created a major course correction to the committee's work. Instead of looking at the broad confessional position of the church, the overture asked that the Assembly narrow the committee's focus to this one issue, church and state. A clear solution was also suggested, namely that the committee return to the work that it had done in its 1945 report. It was a brilliant overture, suggesting the committee's work had gone too far afield and it needed to focus on this one precise task. The result of the overture was significant. Beginning in 1950 and continuing over the next few years, the work of what had become known now as the Articles of Faith Committee, the committee that preceded the Church Doctrine Committee, that was essentially put on hold. Instead, a joint committee that was comprised members of the Articles of Faith Committee and a subcommittee of the Board of Evangelism and Social Action was formed to undertake the work of devising such a statement. It is the joint committee which works on the section related to church and state. In 1951, the committee, they produced their first really substantial report to Assembly. In their work, the committee sent documents down to Presbytery, they received feedback, they commented on this, and they produced 3 documents: a declaration, the preamble to the Articles of Faith, the Articles of Faith concerning church and nation. All 3 documents were presented to the 1951 General Assembly. The Joint Committee was working to create a declaratory clause and spoke directly to their intent. As they had indicated to the Assembly in 1950 their intent was not to produce a, quote, mere interpretive statement to be added, quote, but to replace. To quote the committee, what your committee proposes is a declaration which will, if and when adopted by the Church under the Barrier Act, supersede Chapter 23 of the Westminster Confession and that rider in the basis of union, which at present exempts the chapter from the doctrinal standards of our Church. It would then be incumbent upon the Church to replace the words as adopted in the basis of union in the subscription questions with words signifying the new form of adoption. Knowing the importance of their work, the committee urged the Church to, quote, move slowly in so decisive a matter, and suggested the Church not rush to approve the declaration, but study it and study the articles of faith which it had drafted, as the declaration, in quotes, purports to be a distilled essence of the larger work in a form which we trust will be readily comprehensible. The declaration was thus intended to be the doctrinal statement that replaced Chapter 23 in the Westminster Confession of Faith. The deeper explanation of the issues was to be found in the articles and the preamble. In the printed paper, I'm going to go into some detail on their work, but for our purpose, I want to focus on the response they received to one major question. May the Church aid rebellion? The committee was cautious. The possibility of opposing unjust regimes was kept as a viable option by the committee, but it's worth noting the committee's response to this, what they call the most difficult of all questions referred back. And this is to quote them. Is it true to the witness of Scripture that the Church as Church will ever find herself obliged to encourage and aid rebellion? That's the way they frame the question. And they continue. Now, whatever may be one's theological presuppositions, however strongly one may be prejudiced by his present understanding of Scriptures, a quick and easy answer in the negative is not a becoming answer to so deep and complex a problem as this, not in our age, which has seen in all its brutal and devilish force the threat of totalitarian tyranny. Put simply, the committee was saying, don't just say no as we all want to. Think first. What have we just seen in our world? The Canadian Presbyterians needed such a reminder within 7 years of the end of World War II is worth pausing and considering, and in the height of the Cold War. Loyalty, not protest, let alone rebellion, seems to have been the default position. The culmination of the Joint Committee's work over the next 2 years came when a revised text of the Declaration of Faith concerning Church and Nation was presented to the 1954 Assembly. The declaration passed the General Assembly with debate and dissent. Nevertheless, it was passed as an interim statement. That is, it came into force that year while it was going down under the Barrier Act, which it did. In 1955, the report on the vote under the Barrier Act were reported. 28 presbyteries approved, 8 disapproved. The Assembly voted again to approve the Declaration of Faith concerning Church and Nation. 2 things are worth noting. I've seen the declaration. The first is the most trivial. I've seen dates of 1954 and 1955 used for this. One could argue both dates are accurate because it was affirmed as an interim statement in 1954. The second and more important question or observation is that the passage of the Declaration of Faith did not end the debate. What is worth noting is there are a number of overtures in 1955 which raise issues of church and state. Of greatest significance was the overture from East Toronto Presbytery. East Toronto voted for the declaration, but there were some dissents registered. While recognizing the validity of the declaration, the presbytery raised the question of its status, specifically challenging whether it should be considered a subordinate standard and suggesting instead that it be considered, and I'm going to quote, a comment upon chapters 20, 23, and 31 of the Westminster Confession. The overture also asked the Articles of Faith Committee to return to their task of developing a complete declaration of faith, which they then imagined this part would find a way into and be incorporated. The status of the declaration thus emerged as an issue. And as Peter Bush has recently outlined in a fine article in Presbyterian History, the arguments now became around the vows one took during the ordination service and how one subscribes to the confessions of faith. So despite the intentions of the Joint Committee, the declaration did not replace the 23rd chapter or end the discussion on church-state relations. The Joint Committee had been very clear. Their thought was this would replace it. There'd be no need to reference liberty of conscience. Somewhere along the road, this did not happen. Just so you know, this is what the report of Church and Nation looks like in the 1954 Assembly. It's there, it's important. It's not the only thing though in 54, just important to recognize. So summary, we have considered in detail the background to the Declaration of Faith concerning Church and Nation. The importance of the 1942 Assembly cannot be underestimated. It was after this Assembly and the multiple issues related to church and state were raised that the church, for the first time since 1925, established a committee to deal with issues of doctrine. And that committee then took on, at the direction of General Assembly, the larger task of developing a contemporary statement of faith and was well engaged in that task, until the overture from the Presbytery of Montreal in 1949 rerouted the committee's work back to the one component, church-state relations. It was the Joint Committee which worked on and developed not only the Declaration of Faith concerning Church and Nation, which passed in 54 and again in 55, but also a preamble and articles of faith that give a deeper understanding of what the committee thought. The move from multiple concerns over issues related to church and state, leading to look at these questions within a larger project of the church's belief, which was then set aside, and they went back, which was resolved, but not really. That's kind of the story, but it's not the story that we've told ourselves. Instead, as I suggested at the beginning, we've kind of drawn a straight line from Barman through the Paris Deliverance to the Declaration. And I'm just suggesting it's far more complicated than that. It's also intriguing that to this point, I have not found any reference to the Barman Declaration in any of the documents I've been looking at. References to the situation in Germany for sure, but there's also some other interesting stuff there. There's a surprising amount of anti-Roman Catholic rhetoric, particularly the articles of faith that they produce, not the declaration, but the articles. There's also some anti-United Nations stuff that is really kind of interesting. So I think it's interesting. As you can see, I've been arguing throughout that it's not just the Paris Deliverance. I've also been arguing throughout that while for some Presbyterians, they wanted an opportunity to protest, but we've missed the importance of loyalty, that others really wanted a way of expressing their loyalty more. And I think that's one of the things that we've missed entirely. And so I will just end there and saying this is, when we look at the two things, I would probably stress loyalty a little more than protest. So thank you.
Thank you to Stuart. And we had two excellent presentations and we have lots of time for questions. If you have a question, you can either jump right in, or you can post in the comments that you have something specific that you'd like to ask.
I might raise a question. John Baudry here. Again, both papers were very good, as were the previous two. And I wonder if there's something that might even be in common between the two. At least something I picked up on is that in Rebecca's paper, there was mention of two reasons why they wanted to reach the youth, or two things they wanted to impress on the youth. One, what it means to be a Presbyterian, and two, what it means to be a Canadian. And then later on, you were to subscribe to the paper partly because of your loyalty to Canada, if I heard that correctly. And it just makes me think that there was a very strong sense of patriotism, and there was a kind of blending of church and nation. On the page of the challenge that you showed, there was a reference to Dr. David Perry, who became the moderator in 1929, and his son had been ordained just a couple days before that in Battleford. And Dr. Perry, I was told by a very elderly lady in Wingham, where he served almost his entire ministry, at the beginning of World War I, either the beginning or the end, I can't remember which, he gave, as she put it, on a Sunday morning, an oration on the British Empire. And I can't imagine any of that happening today, or that people would word it, our purpose in teaching our youth is to make them good Canadians. So I'm wondering, at what point did it change? And why did it change? Why was there a sort of a shift in getting away from this patriotic sentiment? Does anybody know the answer to that?
You want to take a stab at that, Rebecca?
I can't say I know the answer without having looked more specifically beyond 1935. And of course, there's another war that happens in there too, which I would imagine, I mean, thinking back to our previous paper too, that maybe war might bolster the idea of patriotism even more, and more within the church as well. But yeah, so I don't know the answer of when that shift happened, whether it was just a slow change over time as Canada's idea, because of course the idea of being Canadian, it was a very specific idea at this point in the late 20s and early 30s, or mid 30s, and very specifically, they want everyone to be a Protestant Canadian too. So there was that shift somewhere in our past too, as Canadians now, where we're a little more open to multiculturalism and having a society where everyone can be their own religion, and that is okay. We're not trying to indoctrinate our youth with our specific idea of what religion and being Canadian means. Anyway, it is an interesting question, and something that I've been thinking about because I actually wrote this paper a couple years ago, and came back to it to present for this. So then I had a whole bunch of new questions that I was thinking about as I read over it again and worked through it. So yeah.
I think it's a great question, John, and thank you. I would also want to stress something though. They also see themselves as Presbyterian. I think you saw that in both papers too. They're really tied into the that tradition. Even those who are trying to express it in more contemporary language, it's that. But both things are held. The anti-Roman Catholic piece is there. That's it. Where does the loss of patriotism happen? We might say it happened in the mid-60s in some of the protests in General Assembly around the Vietnam War, and yet the resolutions that were produced weren't that extreme. I'd actually probably put it in the 80s, but it's a gradual piece. What I would suggest, though, the trajectory on the declaration of faith being seen more in line with the Paris deliverance and more an idea of protest, that is being established in the 60s and the 70s. I think, and that just fits a cultural moment, or that's my thought. But by the time that Bill Klempa is writing some of the things and outlining what's happening, that's what we get, is that this is what we want to be. We want to be able to be critical of the state, of the state. So that would be my best guess.
And just going in the order that people have posted in the chat room, we're going to have questions from William Houghton, followed by MJ, and then Ian. So first, William.
Thank you so much to all the presenters. Really great papers today. So Stuart, if you don't mind, I have two questions for you. One, you at the beginning of your talk, you sort of did a bit of comparison between the, the ease with which the United Church comes up with statements of faith, in contrast to the Presbyterian Church. And in listening to your paper, it strikes me that not just with the statement of faith, sort of the producing of statements of faith, but on other issues such as the ordination of women, that there's sort of a much higher bar in terms of consensus that the Presbyterian Church seems to require before making major changes or alterations to the expression of faith or the church. It's just United Church sort of takes sort of actions, even if they're piecemeal, and then sort of thinks about it after, like an action reflection model of learning in a way, where there seems to be in the Presbyterian Church a need to have everybody kind of come to a really reasoned agreement before a step is taken. And so the question out of that long ramble was, do you think that is perhaps a reaction to the pain of disruption in 25? And my other question, oh gosh, maybe if you answer that, I'll see if I can remember my first question.
So I think so. I think that's true. But I also want to suggest that in reality, in the debate and the rhetoric around, for multiple reasons, around the continuing Presbyterians bound themselves closer to the Westminster Confession of Faith. It's harder to change things. So that's one thing I think that is true. So that's one of the impacts of union that I'm arguing. I think the other truth is that there were voices within the Presbyterian Church in Canada that were very reluctant to change, not it, but any doctrinal position. And so there are debates around. There's this attempt that they never get back to it. And then in the 60s, they try to get back to it. When we finally get living faith in the mid 80s, it's almost a miracle that people didn't give it any hope. And that was the question I had, why? And so I'm trying to just making the case, I think it's when you bind yourself so tightly to it, it's harder to change. And then I think there are confessional positions within the church that make change hard as well. And Peter Bush talks about some of those. And so.
Okay, thank you. And so that actually kind of ties into the first question, which I did remember. And you talked about Ephraim Scott and his quite conservative theological position at the beginning of the presentation.
Yes.
Now, as I recall, in the couple of decades leading up to church union, that in terms of the theological response among Presbyterians to the proposed basis of union, there were those who, we might call conservative, who found the basis of union of the United Church too liberal. But there were also quite a lot of pretty liberal folks, some ministers and professors who had trained in Germany and so on, who thought the basis of union was too conservative. And I guess my question was, what happened to those quite liberal folks after Union? Was it just that, maybe in reference to Rebecca's paper, that the church was just very focused on practical matters, such as, getting youth ministries up and running? It wouldn't have struck me, looking at the time prior to 1925, that this was necessarily going to be, a really conservative denomination that, that wouldn't be comfortable questioning predestination, for another 30 years.
Yeah, and such a great question. And this is where more work needs to be done, which is, I know what historians always say, but the quick answer would be, I think the denomination is involved in rebuilding itself. And so that's the main energy. It's just interesting that a doctrine committee isn't the first thing they do. And so it is in the war that they create that. When they do create it, though, there's a lot of energy there. And I think that's the next project to look at, is what is it they're talking about? And they go back, and it is predestination, but it's also loyalty to the Westminster Confession of Faith. And that's not necessarily a conservative issue, or if it's conservative, it's probably a tighter meaning of the word conservative, that you want to preserve your heritage as opposed to other meanings. So thank you.
Thank you.
We'll have a question from MJ now, and then we'll have questions from two Ians back.
Do you want me to ask both Stuart's and Rebecca's now, or just Rebecca's, because I put both up?
If you can ask both. Yeah.
Thanks. Rebecca, I first of all, I loved your paper. Thank you. Secondly, I was very impressed about the challenge to have grown so much in 1929, when you think of the Depression and everything going on at that time. That was quite the accomplishment. What I'm wondering, though, that is to be crass, what percentage of income or GDP did they use for these children's ministries? Like, how it was a priority to create leadership and all that stuff, but when the money came, how much money from the overall budget did the church use for these children's ministries? How much of a cash?
That is a good question. I'm actually not totally sure, MJ. I mean, I know from the Acts and Proceedings sort of budget page from the report of the Board of Sabbath Schools, that they had a huge budget for children and youth, but I'm not sure what that looked like compared to what else, the grand overarching budget was, and how that would have changed. Yeah, so I'm sorry I can't answer that, but that is an interesting question.
I thought it sounds like it was considered a more professional thing than it is currently. Like, you would have more paid people doing that. Yeah, so that I found fascinating. Anyway, thank you very much. Then I have mostly for Stuart, but I think also for both of you, going back to, I think it was William's question on nationalism. Was this nationalism more of what it was before the First World War, when nationalism was loyalty to empire, or did this nationalism translate into being purely Canadian, since so many people consider the First World War to be the turning point of Canadian independence because of the battles where we came into our own, and people who were saying it's not appropriate for us to have to go to war just because England does. And so that whole, and then Stuart, with yours about it, that was just sort of leading into, after the Second World War, leading into where we got to the point of developing our own flag, and it wasn't that far in advance, and the whole idea of being Canada is separate from the States. And so was that some of the nationalism that you were talking about? Was it as us as a separate identity, or was it still that imperialism that existed?
I would think that for the period that Rebecca's dealing with, and from the period that I'm dealing with, it's within, it's Canadian within empire. It's not separate. I think the more interesting question, though, is the fact that the Prime Minister met with them. I think that's the thing we should pay attention to. It's not, it's the prime minister met with them. So I would just think that's the thing we should pay attention to.
Okay. All right. Thank you both. They were both good. Thank you so much.
Our next question is from Ian Ketchner.
McKechnie.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Two questions, I guess. And the first one is for Rebecca, although I think Angus Sutherland and Ian Mason might also chime into responding to this. I was involved with the CNOB PYPS from 2010 through its dissolution, I guess, a few years ago. And I was fascinated earlier this week when I think it was Ian Mason sent around those artifacts, and there was a poster of a PYPS boat excursion to Port Dalhousie, I think it was. And there was a list of the people on the picnic committee. And one of them was one Mina Kitson. Well, Mina Kitson was a good friend of my grandmother, and I remember visiting with Mina when she was quite a bit older. So that was kind of surreal to see that name. And I guess coming back to my experience with more like latter day PYPS initiatives, it's wonderful that so many of these old posters and booklets and documents and so forth have been preserved, although Rebecca, you mentioned that some of those earlier ones no longer exist. And I guess the question for you and probably people like Ian is, are items from more recent sort of incarnations of PYPS in the digital age, shall we say, being conserved in some way, shape, or form? In the museum world, we call that current collecting. So that's my first question. And the second question, I guess, is to what extent can a line, like a direct from encouraging young people to be good Canadians in the late 20s and early 30s through to the present day, when many of my contemporaries in the PCC are sort of, shall we say, leading the charge in a way on questions of social justice and inclusion and reconciliation and so on and so forth. And is that, could the argument be made, is that like a latter day version of the sort of, you know, Canadian patriotism that was maybe encouraged 90 years ago?
Good question. In terms of collecting more recent day PYPS materials, I hope so, but I couldn't say for sure. I unfortunately was never involved in PYPS myself. I was a camp girl, so I went to Glenmore Camp. But I know that there are, from my time at the archives, a fair amount of things from PYPS in the past. So I'm not sure about current, but I would hope so. Maybe if anybody else can comment on that and know if it's being collected, go ahead. In terms of the comment of the line between the present day, sort of what it means to be Canadian, and in the past, I think yes. I mean, to a certain degree, it's a little different still. I think today, when we are talking about social justice issues in particular, it goes beyond just being Presbyterian. We're looking to meet the love and the needs of people in a wide variety of different ways, and it's not limited to only Presbyterians doing that work. That there are a lot of other people doing that work too, and in different ways. I would say that the focus in the time period I'm looking at is that they're looking more at just how and why Presbyterians are doing this kind of work. That there is a little less, let's explore what other people are doing, or other religions, or even other organizations, and how they're trying to reach out and meet the needs of people in our communities. I can't say for sure. I'd have to look at a wider base of materials than what I was looking at, which was mostly just Presbyterian things, so the challenge and acts and proceedings and things like that. But I mean, from what I read in there, it's you know, some of their human interest stories were about families who were immigrant families who just moved to Canada from China, one of them was, and about that family and how they were learning and growing in Canada. So now, of course, the emphasis was on how this Presbyterian church was helping this family and helping them to become Canadians by teaching them about what it means to be a Christian in Canada as well. So that was an element to it that we wouldn't see in the same way today. But there was that social justice aspect to it in the past that I think, yeah, is a line that we can connect to today too.
Our last question today is going to be from Ian Mason.
Thank you, Robert. Just one of the worst things that you can hear in the museum community, a phrase that strikes terror at the heart of any curator or museum worker is, we knew that you wouldn't want that, so we threw it away. We knew that the museum had that, or we knew that the archives had that. So just an opportunity, I'd say, as far as our items that we've collected from the Presbyterian Young People's Society and all other organizations, is just that it is done on a passive basis. So we have to rely on people themselves who think that this might be something that would be worthwhile to preserve. And that has been the case. But I know that from my own standpoint and the standpoint of the archivists of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, we've tried to be a little bit more aggressive and try to encourage people to make sure that we do have records and artifacts that relate to the organizations that we have supported and sponsored through the church. Just a quick question for Rebecca. Thank you very much for your paper. That was wonderful. On the first slide that you had posted, it had CSET. So I ducked out to the museum set of acts and proceedings, but I couldn't find the 1925 report handy. And I didn't want to do it again because Angus Sutherland said it looked like I went behind one of the trees when I left quickly. So what I did want to ask you is, do you recall what CSET is? I noticed that it was listed in the CGIT. There was a listing of organizations. So there was the South Schools and Young People's Societies. And did you happen to notice? I've never seen that referenced before.
That's a good question. Yeah, CSET. No, I don't know.
Okay.
Now I'm curious too, though.
Okay, well, we're both curious. Okay, thank you. I'll have to see if I can find the acts and proceedings here.
Yeah.
Thank you anyway.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
It looks like those are all of our questions. But
Robert, could I ask give a comment or ask a question, please? It's Clyde.
Clyde, I guess very quickly.
Do we? Sorry, we're maybe over our deadline, are we?
Yeah, we are, but that's okay. Go ahead, and then. Yeah.
I have to say that, like Stuart, the one line that struck me hugely in his paper was the idea of these leaders of Christian denominations heading to Ottawa, having an audience with the Prime Minister to complain about no reference to Jesus Christ in interfaith services that the government was organizing. And it spoke so loudly to something that also appears in Rebecca's paper, and that is this sort of assumption in Canada in the 40s, but also back in the 30s and the 20s with after Union, that the church has the ear of government, and that it is the church's role to train young people to be patriotic Canadians. And it all speaks to, I think John asked earlier, when did this idea disappear? Well, it all speaks to a sort of Christendom mindset in which church and state support one another. And we live in a post-Christian world where the church thinks of itself as quite distinct from the state and critical of the state. And in many ways, you wonder whether the debate over church and nation, in fact, partly paved the way for that, what has become a post-Christendom world and a less friendly attitude toward the state, and certainly a less friendly attitude of the state toward the church. Anyway, just a comment. Silence.
It's a fair comment. I would agree. But I think the Declaration of Faith still has a Christendom understanding in the sense that the church has a right to say something to the state, to criticize it, and there is almost the expectation that the state will listen. So that it's not a separation, but that's maybe for another day.
When they went to see the prime minister, wasn't the prime minister in those days a Presbyterian?
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
He was, but I'm not sure it would be all that different. So here's one last piece of trivia, and then I'm going to kick it back to Robert. I did not know this, but the minister from the church where I was raised at the time became moderator, J.A. McGinnis, and he did not preach the sermon the next General Assembly when he should have. The reason, he had been invited to attend the coronation of the Queen, as had church leaders for the other dominions. So the moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Canada attended the Queen's coronation. That will not happen the next time. So, Robert.
When I went to school in Quebec when I was a child, I'm almost certain that the flag that was hanging in our school classroom was the Union Jack. That tells you how old I am.
Or how recent that was.
That was
John, it's more recent.
Late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah, I know.
In Quebec.
Thank you to all of our presenters and to everyone who asked questions. It's been a great day, and if like this morning, we ask if you're able to do a round of applause if you want to turn your microphones on for a moment.
I want to thank Robert for an excellent job of hosting that section. I want to thank June and Robert for all the work they've done behind the scenes. This has been a very, we've been holding our fingers. We might discover something that went wrong afterwards, but this has been a really, really effective meeting. So thank you to everyone. We didn't know if we could do this, but I think we have. I want to thank the three presenters other than myself for obvious reasons, but I'm really grateful to Rebecca, to Robert, and to Angus for rolling with us. They came to an extra rehearsal just so that we could make sure this goes. So thanks to everyone. We're going to invite people to say goodbyes and leave. We're a few minutes late, but we will keep you posted on some of the other items of the society. And our hope and prayer is that next September, when we gather, we'll actually be able to see each other, but we are also committed to trying to find a way for those of you who are not close to Toronto that you can also participate. And so we'll figure that out. We've done that before in different ways. This year has just meant that we're all there. We're all virtual, but we do want to make sure that we continue to connect across Canada. So thank you very much. And I just want to say have a great day.